Hello and welcome back to my channel, Ladveria Library, where I go over some of my favorite comic book stories. Before we start, I want to say thank you for all the support recently. I finally have hit 500 subs and I'm halfway to full monetization. I know I've said this before, but when I started this channel a year ago, I never even dreamed anybody would watch these videos. It was just something fun to pass the time. I'm still just amazed. So thank you all. It really does put a smile on my face to know that people enjoy these videos. Now, to why you all are here. John Constantine has been building a small group of allies for his war with Satan. Well, kind of. First aligning with a succubus that owed him a favor, and now an angel under his control. It seems like he quite possibly could win this back and forth with Satan, but unfortunately it came with a cost. The one he loved the most has left him, and it was no way heaven would be okay with him controlling their archangel, even if he was cast out. If John wins, could he actually be losing and damning his soul to hell anyway? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you enjoy the content. And let's get into John Constantine, the Hellblazer, Part 4. Continuing Garth Ennis' run, for weeks now, John wanders the streets homeless and a liquor bottle always in hand. It was better than sobering up. The minute he becomes somewhat lucid, he has to think about how Kit's love became hate, or how he pushed his best friend away. No. It was easier to stay in his drunken days and never have to feel or get his shit together. He just kept telling himself why bother. Even killing one of the oldest vampires could only snap him out of his depression for no longer than a second. That rush of winning, of beating his adversary, it almost brought him out of it. It wasn't until issue 71 that after a vision from a World War II pilot that had died in a plane crash did he realize that life was worth living. John saw how hard the man scraped and clawed and fought just to live. It had been a long time since John was himself. 6 months, in fact. He had wasted enough time, and he had lots to do. But first, since he wasn't back to 100%, he decided to take a little trip to New York to clear his mind. He couldn't really explain why New York out of all places. Really, I guess it was just a complete change of scenery that was much needed. But of course, the first place he heads to was a bar. But this was different. This bar had many good memories of better times with friends long gone. He thinks about those friends as he sips his beer and chats with the bartender. But elsewhere, an old friend, or enemy, depending on the day, was being informed that after 10 years, John Constantine was back in the city, and it would seem he wasn't the same. He's lost his edge, his ways have wavered, and he was on the verge of decent. Papa Midnight's sister from beyond the grave tells him to proceed with caution. It was still Constantine after all. But that arrogant smile still haunts Midnight. Constantine had a way of filling you with hatred and rage until revenge was all you thought about, even while asleep. It was like a curse, but he wasn't the only one that felt this about John. Many did. His sister could never understand it. The next day, John was back at the bar once more drinking and chatting it up with the bartender, when he begins to feel odd. Little did he know, Papa Midnight had slipped him a drink, a powerful hallucinogen that caused, as Midnight put it, witch walking. John began to see things only in people's nightmares. A headless man in his drink. The guy next to him grew fangs, and a blood-covered demon cat. Scared to death, Constantine stumbled over himself trying to run out the door. He then looks up to see he was in a dark room with a man at a desk across from him. The man begins to ask him questions. Like name, ever been to prison, and what his destination was in America. John tried to resist answering the man's questions, but his mouth wouldn't do as he commanded, like someone was controlling him. After the questions, the man and the dark room disappear. John was then back in the city, laying in the middle of the street while two cops tried to figure out what to do with him. But then they disappear as well. The streets were empty except for one man in a trench coat. The man knew what John was thinking. Am I in hell? But no, he wasn't in hell. He was still in New York's Big Apple. It was freezing out despite the sky being practically on fire, and then began to rain down crack like it was snow. The man acted like all this was normal even when they passed in front of a dead man hanging from a street lamp. They then walked for a while, having a weird conversation about a girl in one of the buildings getting essayed over and over again when they finally got to their destination, a homeless camp in the park. When suddenly, John's back with the cops. They were walking him up some steps to a homeless shelter. He's then checked in, when again, it flashes back to the homeless camp. John was being restrained by two men while the one that brought him there held a knife to his neck. They were fixing to cut him up and eat him. And if things couldn't get any weirder, it then begins to distort as money rains down. John passes out and wakes up a little while later, blood on his face and jacket. He walked for 15 miles with no sign of anyone, nor was there a sign of day or night. But for some odd reason, he didn't care. Why didn't he care? This was all incredibly weird. Why wasn't he trying to figure out what was going on? His throat had been slit right through the jugular, and yet he was still alive. He thought this had to be hell. But then a voice from behind assured him he wasn't in hell, but in the United States of America, because he was president. It was JFK, bullet hole through the skull, brains protruding from the wound. Back in, I think, the real world? Who really knows at this point? John is completely unconscious, while three men rob him for everything he has, as they try to figure out what to do with him next. Meanwhile, John and JFK in the alternate America have formed an alliance. John would help JFK get reinstated as president, and in return, he would help John with his current situation. They walked for hours until they reached the White House, which shouldn't be possible, but then again, the dead shouldn't be up and walking either. There was a secret passageway underground that would lead inside of the White House, but if things couldn't get any weirder, John noticed that the tunnel looks very similar to the inside of someone's chest. He begins to sink through the soft tissue and blood of the floor when a woman appears before him. Her name was Sedella. She had brought John here to her heart because she needed his help. She says it was her brother who took him witch-walking to this America. He's a man that John knew very well, Papa Midnight. John was furious, mainly because he let a 2-bit hack like Midnight do this to him. But also John was right. He wasn't ready to get back to normal. He had let his guard down and should have realized that just because he took a break from everything around him doesn't mean his enemies had. And now he's been badly wronged by Midnight, but not as bad as Sedella. He was keeping her from moving on in the afterlife, forcing her to be a whore to demons, his spy in hell, and stealing little bits of their power for him. And now, Constantine was her only chance of being free, and moving on. It seemed that Midnight had marked her soul. It's the only way to send an innocent to hell. To do this, you need knowledge. You have to know your victim inside and out, which would be easy for a sibling. John was able to remove the mark, but it was incredibly painful and left her very weak, but it was still better than the alternative. She's able to gain enough strength to lead them towards the exit, and to the current president of this little piece of hell. Unfortunately, the three ran into some trouble. A group of dead Native Americans blocked their path. They wanted out of this hellscape, and knew these three could help them. Their leader shoots John with an arrow that showed him everything they had been through. Settlers stealing their land, the land they were given afterwards rotting with smallpox, and barren so no crops would grow. The only thing they had left was the Trail of Tears. This group were the first to fall. They had suffered more than any other, and John saw it all, but was unable to help them. The chief saw it too. He carries the taint of the old world, and the chief says to him, "Your past is always with you, and the lamp in the hand at the golden door, it burns with the flame of damnation." I have a feeling John will find out what that means soon enough. The group then disappears, and JFK and Constantine continue their journey to the White House, without Papa Midnight's sister. She says she's moving on, and on the way out she'd be paying her brother a visit. Also that John doesn't need her because nothing is stopping him, he just needed to wake up. After about 3 hours, they make it to the Oval Office, and it finally hits Constantine what she meant by just wake up. JFK would never be reinstated as president. The man in the Oval Office that looked like Abraham Lincoln was the gatekeeper, and he seemed to know the both of them. Demon maybe? Constantine betrays JFK, breaking his promise and leaving him there to wander through this alternate America for eternity. John then awakens in the street, the smell of piss strong on his clothes. He looked up to see 3 thugs about to set him on fire, because they hated his pretty boy face. He then pokes the one with the lighter's eye out and heads off down the street, back to the bar. While him and the bartender are once again chatting it up, a man covered in blood comes rushing in. Turns out Sedella got her revenge on her brother, convincing him to take a taxi to the Empire State Building and jump off. And thus ends Damnation Flame. That was probably the weirdest Hellblazer story I've read, but I felt like it was important. It was very interesting watching John realize how soft he's become in the last year, and then watching him get back to that con man we all know and love. And also, what the chief told him could be important later. Who knows? But now, we are going to move on to issue 78, in the beginning of the end of Garth Ennis' fantastic run, Rake at the Gates of Hell. Satan, in limbo so he would not be disturbed, contemplates a new plan to take out his archenemy. He wanted something that not only granted him Constantine's soul, but something that would shake all of creation, that would cause the slaughter of millions. But unfortunately, neither he nor his brothers would relinquish their claim on John, and he had no other chance of defeating them, so he was out of ideas, when he's approached by a newly formed demoness who had a grudge against John, and an idea of her own. Her name was Astra, the little girl John failed all those years ago in his first battle with Nargol. Nargol had took her as his lover, gave her powers of a demon, and she took it willingly, hoping for a chance to use them to take revenge on the man she blamed for her damnation. Seeing her chance, she has come up with a plan to end the deadlock with the three lords of hell, so she may seek that revenge through Satan. But more on her plan later. For now, let's check back in with Constantine. Him and Chaz, now friends again, were on their way to see George when John spotted an old flame hooking on the side of the street. She looked in horrible shape, so John tells Chaz to pull over, then heads over to her. Her name was Helen. She tells him a pimp named Phil had gotten her hooked on smack. He would inject it through her eyelids. Now addicted, she hooks for him in exchange for drugs. Unfortunately for them, Phil was close by listening to the conversation. He heads over, and John doesn't hesitate, throwing a punch but missing, leaving him wide open for a throat chop. It would seem Phil had some karate training. He beats the crap out of John with ease, but it gave Chaz a chance to sneak up behind him and strike him as hard as he could with a crowbar. Phil was out for the count, and the three leave together. John's new girlfriend's sister was a nurse, so they opted to take Helen over to her place rather than a hospital. Phil would be able to find them with ease if they checked her into a hospital. Meanwhile, George was at his mom's place waiting for Constantine, who had completely forgotten about him, when two cops show up with a warrant to search the house on suspicion of dealing. They found less than an eighth, which was probably planted. It was obviously a setup, since he was a big part of the anti-Nazi movement in Britain. So he resisted, and his mom tried to block their way, but one of the cops threw her down the stairs, breaking her neck. George was able to break free, grab his sawed-off shotgun, and bam, shoots the cop that killed his mom in the shoulder, making him stumble out the window. But lets the other cop go, but if he saw him again, he would kill him. Meanwhile, John makes it to his girlfriend's sister's place, and after checking Helen, it was obvious that this was far above what she could do. The girl needed a hospital immediately. She was malnourished, with an infected eye, and that was only the start. She needed an IV and all kinds of drugs. But John said no, that he would find whatever she needed. The nurse says fine, she had a doctor friend John could take her to. And an hour later, her withdrawals began getting even worse. John prayed she was strong enough to beat this. He was tired of watching his friends and loved ones die, but was also worried that getting her involved had sealed her fate. People that get near John tend to die more often than not. Plus he had Satan breathing down his neck. He needed to find the Archangel and get his plan into motion as soon as possible, before Satan does something to someone he cares about to get to him. But I guess, one problem at a time. Helen was trying to kill him at the moment, just so she could escape and get that fix. She nearly cut his finger off before the doctor injected her with the sedative. After Helen was stable and resting, the doctor tells him the same thing the nurse did. The woman needed a hospital. John explains to her the Phil situation and why he can't do that. The doctor eventually agrees, but then tells him to remember that I told you this was a mistake. Meanwhile, Phil was on the hunt for Helen, John, and Chaz. He finally found someone that knew who they were. He got their names and where they live, but it took a little convincing. It cost the guy a finger and tooth to be exact. Checking back in with John, Chaz had heard about George's arrest warrant for shooting a cop, and had told Constantine, but at the moment he didn't have the time. John needed to find the Archangel and fast. So he took the heart to an old psychic friend of his named Nigel. Using the heart, he was able to track down Gabriel. The angel still looked as bad as he did last time we saw him, and seeing Constantine again didn't make things any better. Constantine tells him to cheer up because his big moment has arrived. He was getting a trap ready for Gabriel's old adversary. John would set him up, and then Gabriel would kick the 7 shades of shit out of him. And who knows, maybe after it was all over, John would give him his heart back. But probably not. Chaz was waiting for him when he got back to the car. He had been hearing about George on the radio. Unfortunately, Constantine had enough on his plate at the moment. It felt like everything was hitting him all at once. It was already bad enough he had to deal with Satan, the literal king of hell. But then Helen, and now George? Oh, and speaking of Satan, he had gathered his brothers to Purgatory, a neutral territory where they all could talk safely about his new solution to their Constantine problem. But actually it was a trick. You see, the second and third of the Fallen are devils. Extremely powerful devils, but devils nonetheless. So a simple holding spell would work on them, which Satan has now used to trap them. But the first of the Fallen, Satan, is much more. He's been around since before there were demons, hell, or even angels, and is only devil in name. Which means, even though his brothers are just as strong as he is, they are different. Which means their weaknesses and strengths are different. A simple spell such as holding would not work on him, which means his brothers are screwed, and Satan finally beat them, and now nothing was holding him back from taking Constantine's soul. Meanwhile, John has a knack for sticking his nose where it doesn't belong, especially when it has nothing to do with him. Like this George business. He had no reason to be here. He was exhausted from dealing with everything else going on. And yet, here he is. John has always had this tendency to think that he can single-handedly change the world. But as I've said before, I think it's a mixture of him being a adrenaline junkie and tired of seeing his friends die. George walks through the door. John knew what he was there to grab. After all, their mutual friend Tosser Bates had a big mouth. The two then begin to argue. George wanted to start a war with the Nazis, but if he did, and happened to win, it would prove them right, and they would more than likely be elected into power. But if George loses, he was screwed as well. But John could never understand, because he would always have a choice, George told him. Feeling defeated, John leaves him and heads down the street to ring Chaz. It seemed that while they were gone, Phil, Helen's pimp, had shown up and beat her almost to death. Thankfully, Chaz had shown up just in time because who knows what else he would have done. The doctor took her to a hospital, and Phil had run off the moment he saw Chaz. Meanwhile, Satan pays a visit to John's preacher friend we saw in our previous story. The preacher prays and pulls out a submachine gun, but this was Satan, so the bullets didn't have any effect. Seeing no other way out, the preacher ends himself, but unfortunately, that is a sin. So he ended up in the worst place possible if he wanted to escape Satan. There was now no way out. He belonged to the devil, and the devil only wanted to know one thing. Where did Constantine keep Gabriel's heart? The preacher didn't know, but he knew someone who would. We switch back to John. Him and Chaz arrive at the hospital and then to the room Helen was being kept in. The doctor, nurse, and John's new girlfriend were there staring daggers at him. His girlfriend asked if he was happy he got them all wrapped up in this. They had to sneak Helen in, and are using this room without permission. The nurse and doctor could lose their jobs. Her sister also had to watch as Phil beat Helen. He told her after he was done she was next. But John ignored her and asked about Helen, and if Phil did anything else to her. But his girlfriend knew what he was doing, trying to get himself good and mad enough to hunt down Phil and do God knows what. But John didn't know what else to do. Through all this, he has felt utterly useless. It's the reason he left in the first place. She says, because you are useless. All you've done is make things worse. But it was like he didn't even hear her. Because when he got back to the car, he asked Chaz if he could put a hit out on Phil. He wanted Phil scared, so scared he would never come back, and money was no object. Meanwhile, Satan had found Gabriel and his heart. Gabriel would do anything, even kill John to save his heart and not go to hell. He begged and kissed Satan's feet, but the begging and pleading was for naught. Satan crushed his heart right in front of him. Afterwards, Satan and Astra head to Constantine's place to wait, because there was no point in tracking him all over town. The Archangel is useless, and there was nothing else that John could do to him. But something the preacher said still gnawed at him. He told Satan that Constantine paid a visit to the Caligula Club a day or two ago, and stole some historical pages, but could not tell him more. Oh, and by the way, while all this is going on, a race war has broken out in the streets. Now, let's get back to John. He's realized that Satan stole Gabriel's heart, and went into hiding in a church basement, covering the steps and floor with magical symbols that would keep the Lord of Hell from finding him. But unfortunately, it didn't hide him from the preacher who owned the church. John ends up telling the preacher the whole story about how he screwed over Satan and how he's being hunted because of it. The preacher of course thought he was crazy or making it up, John only wished that were true. His life would be much easier. They then begin to argue about the Bible. That devolves into John being pissed that God wouldn't help him, calling him a selfish child that cared for no one but himself. But it felt more like he was mad at himself. Everything was coming apart. His friends keep dying, and he was alone with no help. John even had to do something he usually would never do. Have a man beaten until almost death. He was like all the bastards he hated, but felt as though he had no other choice. He was in the deepest shit he's ever been in. But then it finally hits him, how rude he's been. He snuck into this man's church, then begins to berate him for his beliefs. Hell, Satan wasn't even looking for him anyway. If he was, the magic symbols would be glowing by now. So John apologized to the preacher, then leaves. Afterwards, he hears from Chaz that his ex-girlfriend Kit was in town and wanted to see him. So he meets up with her, and they catch up for a while and talk about what they've been up to. Until they were on their way to get a drink, things got a little more serious. John couldn't hold back his feelings. When Kit left, it broke him. She was the first person he had ever gotten that close to, and it felt really good. He wanted that feeling back and promised he wouldn't mess it up this time. He would do or go wherever she asked. He would give up magic altogether. He was hers. But that wasn't why she came back to see him. She told him she's very sorry, but like Brendan, who had drank himself to death and refused to stop, John was doing the same thing, but with magic. She couldn't be with someone that was trying to kill themselves as fast as possible again. She came back to get closure and say goodbye. John hated it, but knew she was right. He had to let her go and live her life, because his may be about to come to an end. The next day after Kit left, it was time for John to get back to work. He had another plan up his sleeve, but he needed Nigel and should have heard from him by now. So he decided to check up on him, and it took 5 hours to sneak past the riots and barricades that were blocking the way. Unfortunately, it was all for nothing. John found Nigel in his apartment, dead, stabbed through the forehead. He then suddenly began to feel queasy. It was so bad he collapsed onto the floor and started spitting up blood. Satan was behind him, smiling. He had given John his lung cancer back. Satan asked if he remembered the last time the two were like this. John suffering on the ground as Satan stood over him. But honestly, how could he forget? Satan listening helplessly as John lay on the floor laying out his trap, smiling from ear to ear. Only one other time has the first of the fallen felt that wretched. The day he first fell. He then tells John of his creation and the creation of the universe. And finally, he got to the humans and free will. Give humanity the choice, and 9 times out of 10, they will make the wrong one. God believed that humanity would choose him over anything else, which wasn't the case for the most part, and it drove him mad. To keep Satan from telling the angels of his mental state, he banished him to hell. Ever since they had been at war with each other until Constantine came along. John began to laugh. The first of the fallen was just God's conscience. That little voice in a person's head that tells you not to do something. Satan was God's first creation, before the angels or humanity. During that time, they would talk and make decisions together. When they grew apart, after God had found a new toy, which happened to be humanity, that's when the madness began to show. So you could say God was always mad, and Satan was the one keeping him sane. This angered the Lord of Hell, saying he was just trying to make things better. When Astra suddenly appeared before John, the look in his eyes said it all. He was terrified. He began to shout, "Get her away from me." Satan then asked what he said to her when he led her into the inferno, but Astra answered for him, "Take my hand, don't be afraid, I'll look after you." John begs and pleads. We had never seen him in such terror. Satan was actually beginning to feel a little bad for him, so he decided to just get it over with when he stabbed from behind and sent back to hell from an ally of John's we hadn't heard from in a while. Ellie had taken the form of Astra to fool Satan. It had been her all this time. During the confrontation, John had passed out and awakens a little while later. Ellie was sitting next to him with a clump of cancer cells in her hand. She had pulled them out of his lungs and saved his life, but now he owes her a favor. I swear, the man has got to be the luckiest person in the DC universe. John headed down to the street. The city looked like a war zone, but at least he could walk now. He lit up a cigarette and looks over to see George leaning against a car. It seemed like neither side won. After 2 days and 30 people dead, everybody just gave up and went home, with nothing accomplished. This all started because of George, and was just a waste. A waste of time, a waste of life. John didn't really know what to say to him except, to let that guilt you feel stay with you, and maybe some good would come out of it. 2 months later, Helen was doing a lot better. She lost an eye and had a few scars, but at least she was clean and sober. Even though Constantine blamed himself for her getting roughed up, she never saw it that way. He saved her life. She may not stay off smack or quit hooking, but John had given her a chance, and she would always be grateful for that. And so, John's longest battle yet had finally come to an end. Everything since the beginning of Hellblazer had been building to this last arc. Nergal had been defeated, so had Satan, for the time being anyway, because they always come back. He finally got closure with Kit, and actually saved someone's life instead of sacrificing them. He was in a good place at the moment, but I have a feeling that won't last very long. John still has many more enemies out there that he screwed over. I just can't wait to see where Jamie Delano and Sean Phillips take this truly interesting character next. I hope you all enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you did, and I'll see you in the next one.